There's a lot to grieve in the world, and that's not simply limited to the present-day nature of our reality. Grief is an inescapable aspect of the lived experience, which is why I am so happy for the guest we have on the show today. She will explain what constitutes as loss and grief, whether that be death, job loss, or identity related, and tips on how to find meaning on our journey. Stay tuned until the end for an important announcement. Welcome back to Savvy Psychologist. I'm your host, Dr. Monica Johnson. Every week on this show, I'll help you face life challenges with evidence-based approaches, a sympathetic ear, and zero judgment. I am so pleased to have Hilary with us today to talk about grief. But before we get into that topic, please, Hilary, introduce yourself to the audience. We are so graced to have your presence today.
Thank you so much, Monica. I am Hilary Bucell. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist. So I have a private practice where I work with young adults, and couples. And then I'm also a lecturer at the Columbia University School of Social Work.
Yeah, and I know, I plugged you today to get you in to kind of talk about grief. I know that there's a lot of grief experiences happening in the world right now. And so as a starter, I know that grief and loss are related, but can you give us like a working definition of loss and grief as like a foundational kind of start to this conversation?
Absolutely. So loss is simply something that's gone, right? That's it. The loss is what is gone, what's not here anymore. And grief is our emotional response to that loss. So pretty simple. Grief is, what we're doing with the thing that's gone.
Yeah. And I know something that often comes up is people are sometimes confused on what kind of counts as a loss. Can you talk about the different types of loss that a person can experience?
Yeah, I think this is a really important one. So, probably the most universal truth or loss that we know of is death, right? When somebody is physically no longer here with us on the planet, on Earth. But there are so many other types of loss, and often these types of losses go unrecognized. And so we could call them ambiguous loss. And so a form of ambiguous loss can either be physical or mental. So you can have, let's say, a family member has dementia, right? So that family member is physically present with us, but mentally they're no longer here, right? So that would be an ambiguous loss. Another ambiguous loss could be a relationship ending, right? It could be your children going off to college, right? There's no longer that experience of them in your home. A divorce is another type of loss. There's so many types of loss, the death of a pet, that often go unrecognized or unappreciated by society, that we don't give ourselves like the experience to grieve.
Oh, for sure. I know that I've had some patients who have dealt with job loss, and there's been a lot of grief around losing their job, but also an impact on their identity as well in a lot of these situations.
There's so much tied into what we do, who we surround ourselves with, even kind of how we physically look or move through the world. And when one of those things is no longer present, there can be a really intense emotional response to that.
What are some common signs of a person that's grieving?
Great question. Common signs of grief can be, right, a lack of interest in the things going on in our life. It could be this emotional response, like a physical emotional response, such as crying or even like feeling of an upset stomach. It can be things that also we typically relate to anxiety, right? So like butterflies in the stomach or a tightness in the chest. There's the saying, right, heartache, right? And it's real. Grief is physically felt in the body.
When you are, helping a person kind of decide is it grief or not, grief and depression can definitely have a lot of overlap and be interrelated. Are there certain things that you would be looking for or would suggest people to notice to kind of maybe understand the differences between the two?
So depression can be seen, we can kind of think of it like an umbrella. So it's this like pervasive sense of not enoughness or kind of this lack of interest in kind of anything going on that continues for a prolonged period of time. Whereas grief is more of like a yearning, right, for that thing that's no longer here. And they're very similar. It's not that you're no longer interested in your life like depression. It's more of the longing for this thing that's no longer here is coloring the way that you're looking at the world.
The way that you're talking about grief, it sounds like grief is a very normal process. That, like, probably all of us are going to grieve multiple things throughout the course of our lives.
Yeah. I'd say grief is like the universal human experience. None of us are going to go through life without loss, without having this experience of loss.
I just want to say out loud, I don't like it. I don't want to feel bad. And I'm sure other people like feel that way too. But knowing that there are, obviously parts of grief that can lead to kind of experiences that we're not going to choose on our own. How can I tell like the difference between like, this is kind of like the normal, healthy process of grief versus something that may be outside of that?
The thing with grief, and I want to emphasize, is that there really is no normal way to grieve. There's no specific way to grieve. We often think that there is. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came out with these stages of grief, but it's important to note that those were actually created as stages of dying. She was working with terminally ill patients when she created this, and so it wasn't initially intended for grief. And even before her own death, she came out saying, hey, you know what? These stages aren't linear. So that's a really important one, and not everyone will experience them. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. We don't want to pathologize the way that we're grieving. I think when our experience of grief gets in the way for like a prolonged period of time of us actually engaging in our life, right? So doing our job, showing up for people on the things that we need to, even taking care of like our physical health, right? Like getting dressed, getting up in the morning, right? For an extended period of time, then that's a point where we'd want to seek professional help. So after a really significant loss, I'd say, yeah, there's going to be a period of time where you are feeling that yearning, right? You're feeling really blue. That intensity of feeling is with you, and that's very normal. We actually have a disorder called prolonged grief disorder that takes actually about a year post, at least a year post the death of someone. That's when we start to go, hey, if we're not engaging in our life in the way that we want to, then this might be something that we want to address.
I know that when I work with patients around grief, there's also a lot of judgment that comes up. Sometimes it's judgment about the amount of grief we're experiencing over that particular type of loss. And that can go in both directions. Sometimes we feel like we're doing too much. Sometimes we question, like, am I grieving enough? Do you have any sort of insight or tips on how to work through some of those judgments?
Judgments are values-based assessments, right? Like what's good, bad, right, or wrong, and that's going to differ from person to person based on your values. What I would invite in is that maybe your grief is showing up in a way that's unpreferred, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or wrong. It's there. And kind of like you mentioned, you're like, I don't like it. I don't want to be with it. Right. Of course. Yeah. Of course. Grief is a really uncomfortable experience. Very uncomfortable. The thing with grief too is it often doesn't completely go away. I like to say that we learn to walk with grief. It's not something that, we can box up and put on the UPS truck. It's something that we take for a walk daily. And so this idea of how do we learn to adapt to the grief, to the waves of how it shows up in our life and really hold that tenderly and compassionately. And if we're having an experience of grief, again, that's showing up in ways that are really unpreferred again and again, then that could be a time to take note and go, hey, you know what, maybe I do want to seek help to learn how to meet this differently or meet with my friends or try something new. But if it's really kind of, the loss is initial or it's showing up occasionally, then I might invite in, hey, how do we learn to walk with this grief? Like adapt with it, create new meaning with it in our life now.
The next question might be a little bit complicated. However, like I work with a very diverse population of people and myself hold a lot of different diversity variables myself. And sometimes I work with patients who have a lot of grief around various identity experiences, whether that relate to, race, religion, sexuality, like gender. And like this grief of, you know, these identities represent who I am. Society puts certain oppressive forces against those identities. And there is like a grief response or a sense of like loss in a lot of these like situations. And I'm wondering kind of what your thoughts are on that. Are there different ways to kind of perceive these things or to find pathways towards coping, resilience, community, any of those sorts of things?
So the first thing I'd want to say is that experience of loss kind of alluded to it in the beginning, spoke about it in the beginning, is this idea of an ambiguous loss or a type of loss that society really doesn't recognize. That loss of like, oh, I'm not part of the dominant culture, right? Or my experience isn't recognized. Like that is a loss in and of itself. And so when we have a loss that goes unrecognized like that, it can move towards what we call disenfranchised grief or unrecognized grief, right? So our ambiguous loss moves towards disenfranchised grief. Oftentimes in that space, it can feel really stuck. Kind of, I'm imagining that's something that your clients are coming in with. It's something that my clients come in with, this idea of just feeling stuck. What do I do with this? Am I allowed to grieve this? Society says I can't grieve this. The first thing that both science and, I think community tell us is to label it, to really validate your experience and say, yes, this is a loss. This is something that you are experiencing and many others experience, and yet we don't always name it, but really important too. So the first thing is naming it, validating our experience. And then when we really see something, that's when we can move towards problem solving. That problem solving might simply be, how do I hold this more tenderly? How do I validate my experience? How do I make meaning out of this? And sometimes that's really challenging to do. Or it could be, how do I find community with this? There's so many varied experiences that you're talking about. But in the simple act of labeling it, acknowledging that it's here, then we can effectively kind of move forward in a way that's appropriate, right? Aligned with your values.
Particularly when it comes around this idea of disenfranchised grief, is there any sort of journaling or reflection or any sort of things that you would suggest in terms of helping a person? Because, it's great to name it, but sometimes we need that like step before that of like, I just really need to note what is coming like up for me. Before you can kind of make sense of it and like find a label. I know for me, as it related to race at least, I'm a strange person. Let me just go ahead and say that out loud. But when I was like 12 or 13 is when I fully, or at least initially, had like the full realization of what it meant for me to be a Black woman. Like I wrote a poem and like there was a journal entry that was all talking about the fact that probably for the entirety of my life, I would have to face certain forms of oppression or discrimination. And then, feeling the sadness over that, like crying. Because I had a moment where I was crying, I looked at my hands, and then in my brain, I went, I'm Black. And I smiled because I was also able to tap into the energy of like what my family had taught me about being a Black person or like what I knew of like my ancestors, that this was a part of our calling or our burden or like whatever it is, the meaning that we can assign to it, right? And so, we're especially in a time where like there's a lot, I think, of that energy as well. So like, how do we reflect? How do we ground ourselves, I guess, within, our identity, our ancestry, and find community, whether that be people who represent our same kind of demographics or our allies or like whatever. I also know this is a complicated conversation or question, but when we talk about disenfranchised grief, I don't think we can talk about it without it being kind of complicated and nuanced.
It's a very nuanced thing, and so I'm glad you're bringing these questions of depth in. I have several things kind of like percolating in my mind right now, so I'll try to be clear with them. I think the first thing that you asked too is this really actionable step of how do I even recognize I'm grieving, and I think that that's so important. I too have had clients come into my practice where they're very anxious and actually feeling like sensations of panic. And we later learn, oh, that intensity of feeling is grief. And so, you mentioned journaling. Yes, journaling can be a really lovely thing to do, like having a grief log, or we could just even say like a mood log of like, hey, this is how I felt. And these were the thoughts and emotions that showed up. And then eventually we can kind of look back at the patterns and go, hey, like, what are we actually thinking about? Or what occurred that day. And maybe you're grieving, you spoke of your identity with race, right? So it could be that, you saw something, maybe you saw an advertisement, right? You're a young kid and you saw an advertisement of someone doing a job you wanted to and they didn't look like you, right? And then you just noticed you felt really angry. So we can notice those moments and then make patterns, and that can really help us recognize, oh, actually, maybe this anger underneath it is some sadness, and maybe there's grief there. So it's a really actionable step that we can do. We can have conversations with friends, right, that validate that experience, like, oh, I was grieving, that was real for me. And then in terms of meaning making, one thing we can do is like narrative work. Like, who am I with this loss? What does that look like? What does this loss mean to me? And that can also be like a really lovely writing prompt or conversation to have of what does my life look like now that this thing isn't there anymore? So even another disenfranchised loss is often a relationship, or right, a lack of, right, one that you didn't have. You could even be in a relationship and feel like, oh, it doesn't look like the one I wanted. And so we can really do some narrative work on the thing that was lost and we desired and what our life looks like now. And then, in terms of identities, we can do ritual, right? And that can be a really lovely way of connecting with ancestry, as you're saying, and making meaning out of struggle or making meaning out of our experience that isn't honored by society. And so that ritual can also be really joyous. So it can be this both and, right? So I think you mentioned smiling in the mirror. You can acknowledge, wow, this is such a painful experience that I'm having, right? As like a young Black child not being acknowledged. And yet also, wow, like I really love myself. I'm so like fond of myself, or there's some like beauty in this. And both things can be true, right? We can acknowledge the sorrow and sadness in those really difficult experiences of our identity, and also recognize, wow, there's also beauty in this too. Um, so those are just a few ways that we can move through experiences like these, which are so nuanced, and I'm so grateful, you're bringing them up because we don't talk about them nearly enough.
One thing I wanted to ask about too was kind of the anger piece. I know we've kind of touched on judgment, guilt, shame, but whether it's disenfranchised grief or a loss of a loved one, anger is often a piece that comes through at some point or another. Do you have any specific like tips or ideas about anger?
Anger and sadness, I call them like cousins. I think maybe a lot of clinicians do. And it's this idea that both anger and sadness often they tell us like a goal was blocked. So anger says, has to pay this thing that I really wanted, I'm not getting it. Something's in my way. It's preventing me from getting it. And sadness can say, oh, wow, like something was taken from me, right? It's no longer here. Those are very similar experiences, yet they have really different action urges, because anger wants us to propel towards something, right? And that can often be like an urge that is easier to access. Society almost like condones that more, right? Whereas sadness, we want to retreat. There's an invitation, if you notice, intensity of anger arising frequently. So not, coming in. We don't want to, again, we don't want to judge that anger. It's a very normal part of grief. We want to recognize it. And if we're moving through our anger skillfully, that's great. But if we notice that our anger is actually impacting our relationships or our performance at work or getting us into trouble, right? Then that's something we might want to look at and go, we pause, right? And that could be a really lovely time to do some journaling prompts, even just distracting for a bit, like purposefully, right? Of saying, hey, like I'm going to go and watch this movie or go for a walk or do a puzzle and then come back. And then that can be a moment where we can check in and go, right, like, am I really angry or is there something else here? But it takes a lot of bravery too. Sadness can be a very difficult emotion for people to access. There's a fear, like if I'm sad, I'll never actually get out of it. It's a really brave thing to move from our anger into allowing the sadness to be there. And if we allow that to be there, then we can actually kind of move forward from it.
A big part of what I'm hearing you say is if we kind of move with the experience versus like moving against it, we have a much kind of easier and kind of deepening of the experience.
Yes. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. It's like that analogy, right? Of if you're caught in like a riptide, you actually want to move with the current. The current is going to take you to shore. It might take you further down shore than you want to be, right? But if you actually don't fight it, you're going to come to land. And the same thing happens with our grief. And, grief does come in waves. So again, it's not this linear experience. I really want to emphasize that. And sometimes it shows up in the most unexpected of places. You might be on the subway in New York and there's an ad that shows up and it reminds you, of your pet that you had, 10 years ago, and you're just struck with this intensity of feeling. And so this idea of exactly like you said, moving with it, like labeling it, right? Rather than fighting it like, oh my gosh, this can't be here, right? I can't cry, I can't feel this. It's like, oh, it's here. You can even let that little bit of tear, well up in your eye. Like, oh yeah, I'm feeling grief right now. And amazingly enough, I think I've seen it in the people I work with, even in my own experience, then that grief subsides. It goes away, right? It's like, oh, I'm seen. The message is heard. And then you're able to kind of go back to the present.
Part of what we're talking about in terms of this anger, because as you're talking, my brain is percolating. So questions are
Sure. Lovely.
are
Love it.
coming as you're talking.
Yeah.
So part of like what I'm also thinking about in terms of like anger and some of the not problematic emotions, but emotions moving out of the space of being outside of within normal limits, for the grief situation. Things that I worry about sometimes is like social comparison, right? Particularly when we have, it can come up in disenfranchised grief, in a lot of different ways, comparing ourselves to someone who maybe is in a different socioeconomic status than us or has a different body type than us, or, because there's just so many things that you can grieve. I've even had obviously many of the people who listen to the show probably struggle with mental illness or thinking differences. I've had a lot of people reach out to me who have chronic illnesses, like chronic physical conditions that put a lot of limitations on their lives. And all of these things bring about a grief reaction. And then, sometimes there's the social media comparison that just can sometimes trigger anger reactions, grief reactions, intense sadness or things like that, because we're constantly viewing people who, maybe have what we wish that we could have.
Yeah.
And I
Yes.
guess, if someone's finding that like, these types of actions or behaviors are making their experience worse, is the answer just like, girl, get off social media? Is that like the answer? Are there certain things that we can do to like, be more kind of conscious consumers, I guess?
Well, I do think, that could be an answer, right? Some of those things that are staring at us, right? if social media is really prompting this comparison, right, which is then prompting this anger and intense grief, absolutely. Taking a break is really skillful. Kind of removing yourself from those prompters is really skillful. Another thing that can help kind of soothe that experience, though, is this idea of compassion or compassion for yourself in that moment, even if you're having intensity, like intense anger, right? And so compassion literally, like the definition literally means like to suffer with. And it gets this bad rap. It doesn't mean like condoning, it doesn't mean liking, but it's this idea of like saying, hey, I can be with my really difficult experience and I don't need to push it away. And so it's this idea of saying, oh, I can feel this, this can be here without me needing to engage in kind of all of these behaviors that are really ineffective. So that's one way, right? Like, because maybe it is something that's prompting us and we can't just like remove ourselves from the situation. And that's also can be a really lovely way to start validating ourselves and honoring our disenfranchised grief, like those identity, right? You really spoke to that. Such an important thing for us to do when society isn't going to do that for ourselves. Like actually saying, hey, yeah, this is really painful. This is something I don't have. This is something that society's not giving me. It's not honoring. It's not respecting my experience. So practically, yes, like you said, remove yourself from the social media. Get off, close it out. You don't need to be posting on Reddit anymore. You don't need to be like liking those photos. Like, yes, get off, right? If that's prompting to you. Don't watch the TV show. Don't listen to the podcast. If there's somebody in your life while you're initially having a grief response that's really prompting, you can say to them, hey, like I'm having a difficult time right now with something. I'm just going to take a step back for a bit, right? Like we don't want to ghost people, that we don't want to give them a loss too, right? But we can certainly take care of ourselves. And then, something more internally that we can work on is this idea of just allowing our experiences to be there, right? This idea of moving through it without needing to fix it immediately, validating it and holding it like the space. There's the word I was looking for.
Are there any general tips that you would give for someone who's trying to rebuild following a loss?
Yeah. First, I think it's this idea of not trying to force ourselves to be anywhere in our grief journey that we're not, right? It's really hard to build, right? We can use this analogy. It's really hard to build a house with the foundation if that cement isn't actually dry yet. So that's the first thing that I'd really bring in. Again, this non-judgment that we're bringing into this experience to say, hey, like, there is really no definitive timeline, right? Like, when do I feel ready? Or, noticing when am I ready enough? That's probably a more skillful way to put it. When am I ready enough? And then when we feel ready enough, what is the narrative we want to claim about the loss, right? And that's our choice. So, how do I want to integrate this into my life now? How do I want to view it? How do I want to see it? And am I capable of seeing the places that the loss has maybe ineffectively colored my view of the world, right? It's actually making me see the world in a way that isn't skillful, maybe isn't true, maybe isn't aligned with my values. And can I challenge that? And in that challenging, like creating that narrative we want to, and then being really, that balance, the both and we can be gentle with ourselves and push ourselves beyond, right? Kind of our boundaries, that both and, because whatever's new is uncomfortable and it's going to be new because that thing we had before is no longer there. And so we're kind of going to be fumbling our way around in the dark for a bit. So again, that both and.
I want to say thank you so much for the information. I can feel your compassion coming through the screen. If any of the listeners wanted to integrate a little bit more of you into their lives, where could they find you, for content, or if they wanted to potentially utilize you to help them through their grief journey?
My psychotherapy practice is integrative psychotherapy and wellness, and you can find us online at integrativepsychwellness.com. That's where you can find me. It's where I hang out. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much again for this lovely conversation. And I hope that the listeners take your wisdom and they use it to help them on their journey. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Now is the time for the important announcement. This is the start of my farewell tour, as I will be wrapping up at the end of November. My tenure with Savvy Psychologist has been both memorable and meaningful to me, and it's been an honor to be your host for the past 4.5 years. Thank you to everyone who reached out to me directly and to all of you who listened over the years. I appreciate you all, and I'll still be wishing you the best on your journey. If you want to stay in touch, join me on Instagram at KindMindPsych. And if you have a question for the show, email at psychologist@quickanddirtytips.com. The Savvy Psychologist is the Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. It's audio engineered by Steve Rickyberg. The director of podcasts is Holly Hutchings. Our podcast and advertising operations specialist is Morgan Christensen. Rebecca Sebastian is our marketing manager, and Nathaniel Hoops is our marketing contractor. Follow Savvy Psychologist on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's all for this episode of Savvy Psychologist. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.